Hi everyone, how are you doing today? I am back with some reading updates. I have been away for a few weeks. I've been sick for at least one of those weeks, but feeling much better, having been reading a lot as well, and wanted to share a few small reviews and things with you. I don't have my usual pumpkins and things that I would have at this time of year, but my husband did get me these beautiful sunflowers that are still looking very fresh and cheerful. And we have a little fall candle here as well. And I also have a new book to share. I've been very cautious about buying books this year, but this came in the mail today. This is Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse in this very artsy paperback edition. I have The Waves in this series, which I read a few years ago and reviewed on this channel. But my husband and I decided to read this together. We like to read a novel together every so often, and thought it'd be fun to get the same edition because I like collecting fancy editions. Actually, this isn't that fancy. I think it was like only about £8. But I'm really excited to read this. I've read a number of things by Woolf in the past, of course The Waves, but also A Room of One's Own, and The Death of a Moth. I think there was a third thing I've read by her too. Anyway, I like Woolf. I think I will enjoy this novel and hopefully have a fairly in-depth review to share on it later. But today I'm going to be talking about mainly about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which I reread for a read-along, and I'm going to be coloring something from this Cozy Girl coloring book, because why not? I actually found a picture in here that's just perfect for fall, for us bookish people. It's got a couple of books and a pumpkin that says, well, the books say cozy vibes. So that's what we're all about here. So let's talk about my recent reading. Before I get into The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, one of the books I've read most recently is actually a work of nonfiction. So my friend that I do Reading the World with, we decided to read this book called What is History by E.H. Carr. And it's considered a classic in, amongst history majors, effectively. And it's about the history of and philosophy of history. E.H. Carr was a lecturer in the 1960s who pushed back on some of the prevalent ideas of his generation, namely history presented through mostly a Western lens, and also history as a linear progression of neutral facts curated by a neutral historian. He protested that in order to understand history, you must understand the historian, because the historian is not an unbiased collector of facts, but they actually are choosing what to recount in their works and in their research, and have a big part in history as we know it. This book is a series of lectures he gave, distilled into a book form with chapters. And I really liked it. I studied some history in university and would have probably gone down that route if I hadn't already chosen another route. But I really loved learning about history and doing historical research as part of my elective courses. And so having a bit of background helps when you read this book, but I would say more generally he manages to put into words just a lot of things I think have become commonplace now, but would not have been so in his time. Anyway, I definitely recommend this book if you're into history at all and curious about the ways people have thought about history, the philosophy of history, and written about it over time. Again, some of the ideas seem obvious or commonplace to us now, but when this book was written, they were not so, and he was one of the pioneers of the more nuanced, I think, view of history we have today. At least I'd like to think it's more nuanced. So yeah, that's What is History by E.H. Carr, a classic in its own right, and very thought-provoking. I did finish The Ice Palace. I wrote a review of it on my blog. I'm not going to go over it in depth in this video, but if you're interested in my final thoughts on that Norwegian classic, definitely check out the blog post. I thought it was a very good metaphor for grief. I think that's mainly what I took from it, but there were definitely some things in it that I found to be uncomfortable and which I didn't like. So I don't think I recommend it, but I think there were certain things I did like about it. Overall, I just found it a bit tedious as it went on, and again, there were some parts in it that I just found to be very problematic. So, not a big fan of The Ice Palace. Now, the book I most recently read, or rather short story, is Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, because it is autumn in the Northern Hemisphere, and we're reaching that time of year when many of us like to read cozy autumnal classics, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is indeed themed around autumn. In fact, I would say the autumn aesthetic is the main feature of the story, especially of the original story as written by Irving. Growing up, my main familiarity with Sleepy Hollow was the Disney animation, the old one from like the 40s or whatever, starring Bing Crosby as the narrator and the singer. So it's an animated musical. It's like a short film basically. Although it has pretty much all of your usual Disney tropes and things in it. And it's actually really well done. It's very intense in places, and the songs are fun, and the animation is delightful. Of course, if you don't know, many of you will know, but some of you may not know, the story is about this hapless school teacher named Ichabod Crane, who lives in an old Dutch American town, very sleepy town. Hi everyone, sorry for the interruption. My camera ran out of battery, so I'm going to record the rest of my review on my phone and include some pictures, which is just as well because I was going to try to include some illustrations for this part. But anyway, continuing on. So Sleepy Hollow, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, is about this hapless schoolmaster, Ichabod Crane, who is thwarted in love and money by his arch rival Brom Bones. Brom Bones is the local prankster in this Dutch American town, this sleepy Dutch American town, and he finds a way to prey upon Crane's superstitions and especially on his fears of the ghostly apparitions that are supposedly haunting this town. And so that's the gist of this short story. I found a really nice edition of this on Wikisource that has the wood engravings from an 1864 reprint, and I just love these kinds of illustrations, so that was right up my alley. One thing the Disney film does very well is build up the tension and spookiness of the story. They really went all in on it, and I think it was a good change because the original story is not quite there. In the Disney film, there seems to be a real and imminent threat to poor Ichabod, lurking in the smiling town and in the monstrous forest around it. But by contrast, as we read the short story, Washington Irving is content to meander through Sleepy Hollow, stopping frequently to comment upon the nature of its inhabitants or describe the beautiful autumn scenery. So when even you've got Ichabod confronted with his worst nightmare, the story is very unassuming and the apparition is very mild-mannered, which is a far cry from the vicious being of the animated film. What I most appreciated in the original short story were the historical asides. Ichabod Crane's fears are largely rooted in his overconsumption of this book. It's a book about witchcraft by Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather, who played a large role in the Salem witch trials. And then you've got the Headless Horseman, who is fabled to be a Hessian mercenary from the American Revolution. So these details tie into a larger American literary tradition, the ghost of history horror's past. And this tradition is further developed later on in Nathaniel Hawthorne's preoccupation with the Salem witch trials, and also with William Faulkner's exploration of Southern Gothic decay in the 20th century. So I appreciated that. I appreciated how Irving helped shape this tradition. And these little details in the story kind of form the underpinnings of these bigger themes. The other interesting tidbit about this story was how it influenced American literature as a whole, not just in establishing themes, but establishing its place on the world stage. So according to what I read on Wikipedia, Washington Irving was in need of cash, and he asked his friend Sir Walter Scott to help him get a book of short stories published in England. So this short stories collection became the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman, and it was published across the years 1819 to 1820. And it included another of his famous short stories as well, which is Rip Van Winkle. And it did very well. This serialized collection of stories was very successful. It impressed the British reading public. They were amazed at his use of language, and it gave credence to American literature at a time when American literature was looked down upon by some English critics. So that was huge. That was huge for Irving, but it was also huge for American writers in general. In terms of the writing, I wasn't frightened, as I've already indicated, by this story, but I did enjoy its descriptions of New York countryside and the traditional foods that the thin but ravenous Ichabod Crane was such a glutton for. There's a couple of excerpts that just really made me smile. There's one where he's looking at these animals outside at the farm and just picturing how they will become meals in the future. And the language here is just very, very vivid. I'll just read this bit. In his devouring mind's eye, he, that is Ichabod Crane, pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie, and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. And it goes on and on. And then in another part of the story, Irving, this is the author now, is describing the food at Katrina's home. There were apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces, not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them, with the motherly teapot sending up its clouds of vapor from the midst. There is something about this culture, this aesthetic, this era of literature that really speaks to me. It's very wordy, it's very loquacious. There's a lot of historical pondering and Puritan religious underpinnings, not just in Irving, but in other writers. But I connect with it really strongly. I think it's part of our shared American heritage. And The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is very tongue-in-cheek, but we do get glimmerings of this early American landscape, both cultural and literal, American values and traditions of the time, American industry, and of course, glimmerings of the horseman, who is not very foreboding so much as quaint. So those are my impressions of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. it was a wonderful way to spend a few afternoons at this time of year, and if you've not read it, I definitely recommend it, but don't go in expecting horror. It's more of a cozy jaunt. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.